Good morning, and welcome to our continuing series, Poetry for the Soul, Part 10. In these quotations by poets, writers, dramatists, etc., one can also see as opposition to the deeper expression of the soul, the banality of the mind's wit, and its superficiality in some of these quotes. We make out of the quarrel with others rhetoric, but of the quarrel with ourselves, poetry. William Butler Yeats. Poetry is a counterfeit creation and makes things that are not as though they were. Poetry and progress are like two ambitious men who hate one another with an instinctive hatred, and when they meet upon the same road, one of them has to give place. Charles Baudelaire. So those last two, what do they mean? What relevance do they really have to poetry? But now, Vladimir Nabokov writes, poetry involves the mysteries of the irrational perceived through rational words. And Georges Braque, reality only reveals itself when it is illuminated by a ray of poetry. And then the American golfer Arnold Palmer, what other people may find in poetry, I find in the flight of a good drive. The blood jet is poetry, and there is no stopping it. Sylvia Plath. American poet and novelist, whose best-known works are preoccupied with alienation, death, and self-destruction. There is not a particle of life which does not bear poetry within it. Gustave Flaubert. In poetry, everything which must be said is almost impossible to say well. Paul Valéry. Poetry is either something that lives like fire inside you, like music to the musician, or Marxism to the communist, or else it is nothing. An empty, formalized bore around which pedants can endlessly drone their notes and explanations. Unknown author. I would especially like to record the muse of poetry, who ran off with the mailman 4 years ago, and drops me only a scribbled postcard from time to time. By poetry, we mean the art of employing of words in such a manner as to produce an illusion on the imagination, the art of doing by means of words what the painter does by means of colors. Thomas Babington Macaulay. Religion, like poetry, is not a mere idea. It is expression. The self-expression of God is in the endless variety of creation, and our attitude toward the infinite being must also, in its expression, have a variety of individuality, ceaseless and unending. Rabindranath Tagore. I come here to speak poetry. It will always be in the grass. It will also be necessary to bend down to hear it. It will always be too simple to be discussed in assemblies. Boris Pasternak, 1890 to 1960. Music has a poetry of its own, and that poetry is called melody. Joshua Logan. All slang is metaphor, and all metaphor is poetry. G.K. Chesterton. Most wretched men are cradled to poetry by wrong. They learn in suffering what they teach in song. Catullus, Roman poet, 84 to 54 BC. Poetry is adjectives expressed in nouns. Leo Stein. It takes most men 5 years to recover from a college education and to learn that poetry is as vital to thinking as knowledge. Brooks Atkinson, American journalist and critic, 1894 to 1984. That's the way it is with poetry. When it is incomprehensible, it seems profound. And when you understand it, it is only ridiculous. Galway Kinnell. Writing criticism is to writing fiction and poetry as hugging the shore is to sailing in the open sea. John Updike. Poetry is that art which selects and arranges the symbols of thought in such a manner as to excite the imagination the most powerfully and delightfully. William Cullen Bryant. All of the arts, poetry, music, ritual, the visible arts, the theater, must singly and together create the most comprehensive art of all, a humanized society, and its masterpiece, free man. Bernard Berenson, American art critic, 1865 to 1959. There are so many tender and holy emotions flying about in our inward world, which, like angels, can never assume the body of an outward act. So many rich and lovely flowers spring up which bear no seed, that it is a happiness poetry was invented. Jean-Paul Richter. It is written on the arched sky. It looks out from every star. It is the poetry of nature. It is that which uplifts the spirit within us. John Ruskin. History, we can confidently assert, is useful in the sense that art and music, poetry and flowers, religion and philosophy are useful. Without it, as with these, life would be poorer and meaner. Without it, we should be denied some of those intellectual and moral experiences which give meaning and richness to life. Surely, it is no accident that the study of history has been the solace of many of the noblest minds of every generation. Henry Steele Commager. Poetry, even when apparently most fantastic, is always a revolt against artifice, a revolt, in a sense, against actuality. James Joyce, 1882 to 1941. Words are always getting conventionalized to some secondary meaning. It is one of the works of poetry to take the truants in custody and bring them back to their right senses. William Butler Yeats. There are certain things in which mediocrity is not to be endured, such as poetry, music, painting, public speaking. Jean de la Bruyère, French satiric moralist. Poetry is something to make us wiser and better by continually revealing those types of beauty and truth which God has set in all men's souls. I have a new method of poetry. All you got to do is look over your notebooks and think of anything that comes into your head, especially the miseries. Then arrange in lines of 2, 3, or 4 words each. Don't bother about sentences. Allen Ginsberg. American poet, 1926 to 1997. Written poetry is worth reading once and then should be destroyed. Let the dead poets make way for others. Then we might even come to see that it is our veneration for what has already been created, however beautiful and valid it may be, that petrifies us. Antonin Artaud. The gross heathenism of civilization has generally destroyed nature and poetry and all that is spiritual. John Muir. We read poetry because the poets, like ourselves, have been haunted by the inescapable tyranny of time and death, have suffered the pain of loss and the more wearing, continuous pain of frustration and failure, and have had moods of unlooked for release and peace. They have known and watched in themselves and others. Elizabeth True. I by no means rank poetry high in the scale of intelligence. This may look like affectation, but it is my real opinion. It is the lava of the imagination whose eruption prevents an earthquake. Lord Byron. Poetry. A criticism of life under the conditions fixed for such a criticism by the laws of poetic truth and poetic beauty. Matthew Arnold. Clarity, clarity, surely clarity is the most beautiful thing in the world. A limiting clarity I have not, and never did have any motive of poetry but to achieve clarity. It was George Oppen. This is by Larry Summers. In politics, as in poetry, it is sometimes true that it is darkest before dawn. And the last one, poetry is fact given over to imagery. Rod McEwen.